Hear that. All right, everyone. Welcome to the forensics meeting on this lovely summer day. I'm sure y'all are enjoying the weather outside. I know I am. Pleasure you're all here. Hope our exams are going all right. Everything's going good. We're here to talk about forensics, everyone's favorite subject, especially in CTS. It's a lot of fun. Myself, Bryce, and Suchit will be presenting today. So hopefully it all goes pretty good. All right, after this meeting. Cool. Announcements. Minecraft Gaming Social is coming up this Sunday. Should be fun. A little bit of de-stressor for everyone. Get to play Minecraft with everyone. Don't know how we're running that yet, but LAN? Yeah. Everyone loves a LAN party. So it should be good. 5 p.m. Yeah, we'll see us 1404. And again, good luck with finals. All right. There's the meeting flag on the loose, and a lovely comic there. Sure. Give you all a few seconds of that if you want. All right. And for the agenda, we'll be running through the file forensics, file format steganography, smells forensics, the memory, and a bit on sleuthkit. That was a screenshot I took of a CTF earlier this year. As soon as they created the forensics challenge, first two comments, I actually took that screenshot like 2 months ago, if I remembered it for this meeting. It's like, yes, this would be a great time for that. All right, let's start off file forensics.
So file extensions is a hint to users in the OS about the file's like intended purpose, but the content itself can be arbitrary. So you can use magic bytes or file signature to determine the format of a file. So for example, PNG start with format 89, 50, 40, 47. We actually did this at like Cyberforce. One of the challenges was basically they would remove the extension from the files, and we would have to use, like binwalk or other tools to actually find like the file format extensions from that. And you would use the metadata such as, the starting. Stop looking at me, Michael. You would use information such as this to figure out the extension ending. So as I mentioned before, we abuse binwalk. You can use it to, it's basically like file, but it's like recursive. So some of the binaries itself will include like metadata or assets. So when you run binwalk on like a specific file, you don't even have to actually add the ending extension. You can just use command, and then it will give you a list of information about the file. It's extremely useful if you want to figure out some like hidden metadata, like in an OSINT challenge. Let's say you open a file and then it will give you like location taken or date taken. You can use that to sort of like figure out how to go from there. So the usage, you put the title binwalk, put the file, and then if you do the -d extension, you can extract the file format from the file itself.
Yeah, a lot of times you find other file formats within a specific file. A lot of different Stego challenges have like zip archives hidden within like different images, and binwalk can extract those pretty easily and makes going through those much simpler. We also had one of those at Cyberforce. I think it was like the encrypted challenge, cursed image, but it I think 5 zip archives in it.
Yep. So how do you know which format you should use
for which one?
for each of the formats? Like if you were to run binwalk and you get multiple formats back, how do you know which one? Or how do you like determine like which one?
Oh, like you get a lot of different results back from the binwalk. I mean, you can go through each of the ones. Ivan or Thomas, take them. Yeah.
I guess I can talk a little bit more about that. binwalk will usually only give you one file format, but I guess if it gives you multiple and you don't have like the actual extension, what I actually did was I kind of finessed this during Cyberforce. You can just like add the extension to the file, and then if it like gives you like garbled garbage, you can basically be like, okay, that's not the file extension. Because the moment I put like the correct file extension on the files, it's just like loaded properly, because that's like, yeah. So you can try that. There are probably some jank challenges that disallow that to like mess with the metadata or something, but most of the time, yeah, you just pop on the extension, you should be able to figure it out.
Yep. All right, and strings, everyone's favorite command. It's pretty self-explanatory. If you couldn't tell from the name of the command, you get strings from a file. It only gets mostly the plain text ones from a file, which is pretty simple if you have binary finals. It's really good at getting different DLLs, other strings from executable files. You get a whole lot of useful information about what this file was made to do, what it's using inside of it. Just very useful for like an initial understanding of what's going on here. And there's a lot of cool parameters you can do to strip down your input to what you want. If you want more complicated strings, which are more likely to be useful information, you can, like the example says, limit the strings to length of 16 or greater, and typically get larger file paths, what DLLs are happening, and all that jazz. All right, and XXD, printing out a hex dump of a file. If for whatever reason you know a bunch of hex patterns that are going to be useful, then this is a good thing to do. Also, advanced hex manipulation. That's something that I haven't really gotten into, but for different CTF challenges, this can be pretty useful. And same thing, pretty simple usage. Yeah, and there's a few other hex editors you can do from there.
I guess to add to that, you can also look for hidden messages in your hex editor. I think that was for one of the challenges. And you can do a lot of cool manipulations with certain hex editors, like you can change certain like bit or certain like hex values, and then see how the actual file changes. So graph, this is a great one. You can search for text message matches file or in files. So you just set grep and then whatever text you want and the file.
Do you guys know the context of this one?
It's like why it's named grep.
No, just a picture.
Okay, I know it's on Henry's.
So, my favorite there. Okay.
Yeah. that was these are was part of last year's slides, which I think you presented on.
Yeah, I made a
Okay.
forensics challenge include the memory dump, and I looked for almost all the strings, but you can put on, I think it's with a flag or that string, just got it. Where you could pull that out of memory dump. So I had to redo the challenge and redact it because the flag was inside the memory dump. There wasn't any of the files.
Okay, I think I remember that now you mention it. Okay.
So you can to add on, you can also have the file itself and then grab from it, and then you can also run strings and then grab text. So this is easy if you like want to look for like a flag in your text file that you run strings on to get all the potential strings, and then just grab for a flag if you want to like look for any like semblances of the CTF flag. It sucks. So you're hiding data and yeah, you hide data and other data basically. So it's guessy. So basically you'll try a method, like we did this during cyber force, you'll try a method, it won't work. You'll try another method, it won't work. And then you'll do some random nonsense and something will work. You can try a lot of ideas, waste a lot of time, and there's a statistical approach, though I personally do not have much experience using the statistical approach, but I guess Andy does. So one of the most common techniques that they'll use in CTFs is the least significant bit encoding. The reason this works is, let's say you have a certain image data. Obviously, if you change the least significant bit of that image, it doesn't actually affect the visual of the image as much. So CTFs love it, but you basically take the least significant bit of each color, and then you can modify it to form like a message. So what that'll do is when you compare the before and after images, the color itself won't change that much, but there will be the embedded message within it that you could like decode as like a binary like message. So for example, you would take the RGB values and you see they're binary, and then you could change like the last bit of it to be whatever message that you wanted, basically. And this image is a little funny, but as you can see, like the original and the LSB encoded, they aren't that different. It's not a very like noticeable change, which is what makes it really good for these sorts of challenges, because there's no like visual distinction that you would be like, oh, this could be the answer. So you kind of just have to like know the specific technique, look at the least significant bit, extract it, and then try to read it there. Yeah. And this is just its encoding, unless you've LSB encoded it. So image Sego for malicious purposes. So if you were in a red team scenario and you have control over the machine, but you need to execute, download and execute a binary file, basically, if you have deep packet monitoring or some other inspection or antivirus, plain shellcode could get detected immediately. But if you do embed this within your image and you have like a secret binary encoding with LSB, this is way less suspicious. And then you could potentially execute it after you've downloaded and extracted the image. Then you could have like some sort of function or like a script to run that least significant bit, and you can evade a lot of the easier detection methods and even some of the better ones. So audio stego, I think we also had this at cyber course. I had like a bunch of radio signals, and I kind of like had to like get out of my way. So like getting the answer. So audio stick is a spectrogram 90% of the time. There's also FA2025 frequency modulations, and there's also like grouping stuff. So for the radio Cyberforce, you basically had to like group it. The answer was like 21 or something like that. You had to group the messages in like a 21-second like thing, and then you would actually get like the correct message out. So stuff like that. Audio is very good because it'll sound random unless you group it or like modulate it correctly. And then you use tools, obviously, for audio. You want to use some sort of like radiogram or some other sort of tool that can mess with audio. Kidnap an ECU major. Yeah, kidnap an ECU major is a great idea to solve these stegos. Trust.
We'll have that disclaimer for the start of the year slides. Yeah, yeah. So instead of doing ethics, we're here talking about kidnapping ECE majors and forensics. So I'm glad you all were enjoying the meeting. We'll go to continue on. So the starting point with Stego challenges. The first part is just figure out what are we working with. Like we talked at the beginning, file or bin walk are great candidates to figure out what type of file it is, be those magic bytes. If it's the Stego kind of challenge, the image is video or audio. Look for those and get this embedded sort of files in there. Zip archives are very common with that sort of thing. Also, Windows files, especially the Office systems, like docs, PDF, not PDFs, but PowerPoints. Those are very fun and super easy to hide stuff within. At Dice CTF, we were on the last leg of a 14-part challenge, and we didn't bin walk the doc file to find there's embedded image of a rated place in Vienna, and we missed out on the answer. RIP. But I'll always look for stuff within the files. It's very useful. Same thing with so stuff that seems simpler, like plain text or binary files. What sorts of patterns are present within there? Just try and work it out logically, and you'll do pretty good. Also, any sorts of metadata, that's very useful because especially with images, if we'll have metadata embedded, right, where the photo was taken, how it was encoded, what file type is it, etc. It's very nice. Absolutely.
Funny story from Cyberport. We actually extracted metadata from one of the files, and it gave us a bunch of location data. And we were trying to track this person down, so we were very excited. We were just like, "Oh, they were here at this time. They were here at that time." But at the top of the file, it mentioned a squirrel. So the file data wasn't tracking a person; it was tracking a squirrel's movements. So we spent about 20 minutes getting excited that we were tracking our target when instead we were tracking a random squirrel. So make sure to look out for metadata. It's very important. You might be tracking a squirrel instead of a person.
True that. Yes.
Oh, that's forensics. So logs will obviously provide valuable information about what happens on a system. Always look at your logs. Unless the attacker obviously deletes them or overwrites them, then you're kind of screwed. But you can construct a list of events that occur, and you can determine like an entry point or root cause of the attack and what the attacker did. This is what most ERs or most forensic investigators will go about. They look at the logs, be like, okay, what files were accessed? How do they hit this? Where could the potential entry point be from? And then diagnose the vulnerability from there. In Linux, the locations where you can look at the log files are var log http access.log. So this is just your like access logins for websites, your syslogs, and service loggers, and like your bash history, or like your vim info. But obviously the attacker has to be kind of dumb to just like leave.
Or if you're the Cyberforce event staff in 2024, you can leave all the bash history locked and see all the vulnerabilities where people put them. So this goes both ways.
That is true. Last year when we were doing the Cyberforce competition, they left like their entire like thought process about how they put vulnerability in their bash history. Always check. Always check. That's the key.
Mm-hmm.
For Windows, you can use like the event viewer, and then PS with read line module. So this is the way that you can get like the history of like your PS execs and stuff like that. And then you can also check the Windows forensics and Linux forensics flags from Purple Team or more. It gets very expansive very quickly, and it's kind of like a breadth of analysis you can just click on the checkbox.
So it's in the PS PowerShell.
Yeah, PowerShell, yeah, PowerShell. So the starting point, you want to look at what you're given initially. So you want to see if you have like an archive with a full or partial file systems, and then you want to inspect the logs, the user files, command history, etc. Basically, you want to look at what you're given initially and then build from there. Then you can look at disk image files, follows the file system format. You want to check your formats. That's pretty important in terms of like the type of information that you're looking at. Deleted files can be present. You want to look for any hidden or deleted files, or you could potentially try to use forensic tools like reconstruct any like malicious files or files that were corrupted to see if there's any like hidden metadata there or stuff that you can recover. So then mount it on a live system, examine the contents, and then it is pretty difficult to perform forensics on a live system, but because obviously it's very volatile, stuff is moving around and logs are being added. But you can like obtain a disk image and then preserve the live system evidence. So you can basically take like sort of like intermediate snapshots and then observe from there at like different time stamps to like see the different like files that were added or potentially deleted, depending on your time that you can build sort of like a timeline from there.
And so in a CTF challenge, or if you're doing some sort of forensic investigation, once you have a disk image, like the files listed there, DD, ISOs, virtual machine or VMD DKs are very common on these sorts of things, just because they're easier to get and build challenges for. Once you get one of those, you have to actually be able to get access to it, read the files on there, recovery deleted files with different file utilities. The SleuthKit is great for that. Once you have it, there's a bunch of different options to go through it. Autopsy is one. We'll get to that in a second. If you just want to mount it, look through it, all the files manually. Arsenal Image Mounter is fantastic. And a lot of the blue team training that I've done, it's super easy. You just download it, install, and then open any sort of disk image on there. Where I've had issues with autopsy in the past, Arsenal will get it done really quickly. This isn't an ad, they have a free version, but it's super easy to get it set up. And on Linux, you can use a loop device and then mount to get that set up. Sift is a great Linux forensics distro by Sans. I've used that a little bit in the past. It works pretty swell, so yeah, do that. And brief bit on autopsy. It's the GUI version for the sleuth kit, which is a bunch of different digital forensics tools, all in one package. Very useful to use, have experience with. It runs on pretty much any distro that y'all will be using, and has some really cool capabilities. Disk and file analysis, like we're mentioning, so you can just throw your disk image into autopsy, and it'll automatically go through with any of the parsers you select. Some of the common ones, your email artifacts, registry keys, browser history, gets any images off of there. When it does work, it is super cool. I'd recommend checking it out because it makes your life as an investigator quite easy. And then there's just like a little image of the user interface. As you can see, there's a whole lot of tree tabs on the side where you can see everything put nicely. You don't have to go scrolling through everything manually. Yes.
So when you take a snapshot of like a disk image
Mhm.
that ISO file,
Yep.
that will contain logs from the current disk, or
Yeah, I think yes.
when you run the ISO file after mounting it, you
Mhm.
get logs.
Are you talking like running a lot? Like,
So I guess like, are the logs already on the explicit file, or are the logs created when you run it?
I think the logs that if you took the snapshot will be present from when it was running in the past before the snapshot, and then once you run it again, it'll start generating logs.
I guess to expand on that, let's say you had like Windows, you can look at like the sys logs and stuff like that from your ISO from that past snapshot. So it'll have the logs in like those specific folders from like up until you took that snapshot. So that, I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. Right.
All right, and then on to memory forensics. There's going to be a bit more. I hit some of the slides because it gets really in depth for no reason. I just want to do research on the slides. So if you want to learn more about like symbols, tables, and volatility, feel free to check those out for more. All right, memory forensics. So instead of getting a disk image like we were just talking about, you're given a memory dump or RAM in the form of a dump file. So there's a few ways this usually happens. So if your computer crashes or blue screens on Windows, you get a memory dump there, hybridfill.sys, any sort of things there. Or on Linux, the same thing too. Or you can also get it by different acquisition tools that acquire different parts of memory. On Windows, WinPmem is good. FTK Imager has one as well. There's a lot of different ways you can go about that. Same thing with Linux. ATML is the easiest. Wine also works, but it's really annoying to use. And so you can get a dump of either a specific process or like the entirety of memory at a given time, which is quite useful for forensic investigation. Contains all sorts of useful information, passwords, clipboard content, network connections. That one's pretty nice, especially when you're trying to trace back where different malware on the system was communicating to, entries in the master file table, seeing what was accessed when, because that will likely be loaded into memory, or parts of it will be. All the DLLs that are loaded, also LSAS. Fun stuff. And then for actually analyzing the memory dumps, volatility is what most people use because it's pretty easy to use and very, very good at what it does. Analyze memory dump files. There are two versions of it. One, I've worked with Volatility 2 more than Volatility 3, but I'm slowly switching over. Volatility 2, as the number would imply, is older, but it does work very, very well. There's a lot of support from it. It's not as up to date, but the plugins that it has are very good. It doesn't have all the Windows 10 symbols, I think, in the current release, but you can get those elsewhere, and it'll still get the job done. As for Volatility 3, this is the Volatility framework's like complete rewrite of Volatility. It's still under development right now. They're getting pretty close to finishing it up, I think. I haven't checked the GitHub repo in a while, but it is still there. It is missing some features. I think there's not as many plugins as Volatility 2 has, but it's slowly getting there. And within a few years, it'll be doing really good. It is a lot faster though, and it's a different way of profiling OSs and actually parsing the memory. And it's intended to be used as a library with different support. And again, the version number is also really weird for FA2025, as you can see. It's a little funky. And as we're setting it up, it's pretty straightforward. Just go on the GitHub repo, install it, and then just go to town. The syntax is pretty simple. Just specify the file, the plugin name. If the plugin name has any options, it's pretty straightforward. As you can see there, it's just like ball.py, specifying the files memory.dump, and then running the Windows PS list command, which gets all the running processes at the blank time the memory dump was taken. And it's got all sorts of fun information. And you can choose different plugins. You can see the process tree, different views where the process information is kept. You can check correlations between those things. There's just a lot of really neat things you can do with that. And then we're getting on to symbols, because the way FA2025 works is it reads through the memory using symbols tables for each distribution. Microsoft, and a good thing that it does do, it publishes PDBs with full kernel data. So FA2025 can automatically download them and parse, I think, almost all Windows distributions without you having to do anything, which is pretty chill. Linux takes a bit more work. As I'm sure you all know, when there's a lot of things going on with Linux, a lot of distros, versions, different kernels, architectures. It's a lot of work to profile, make symbols tables for each different version of Linux. The thing that I do when I normally have to analyze memory for Linux memory dumps is use the remote symbols tables. There's this guy on GitHub called Abyss Watcher. He just has most of the most common distributions and kernel types on there, so you can just remote fetch them every time you run volatility, which makes it a lot nicer, because you don't have to create a new symbol table every time, which can be a hassle if you're doing more than one, because it's a pain. You have to use Dorf to JSON. It gets complicated real fast, but it is pretty simple to use and all that jazz. And there's some more plugins for volatility. Those are just some simple ones. I've included some links down below if you want to see more of those. Also, you would use it in like an actual investigation, but you can see all the different registry keys, TCP UDP connections, et cetera, et cetera. It's pretty nice. Or if you don't want to do any of that, if you remember strings from earlier, you'll never get, but a lot of memory is just plain text, unless you're encrypting things in memory, which might be a little suspicious. Yeah, in which case, if you're going through malware, volatility is pretty nice, but you can find a lot of useful information in memory just using strings. And yeah, you can grab for it too, if you remember that. And all right, that's all, folks. Any questions?
Yeah, since you've been playing around with it, how good is the state of like modern memory forensics? Because I know that's something that like folks are kind of playing with. There's one of the only ways to catch some of the malware I was designing, and a lot of it's very experimental. Puts a lot of effort into it. So do you have any setups like beyond volatility that are like ready to go, pull like all the memory from the system, or any like good collection methods for that?
Pulling memory just like ad hoc.
Including the kernel. So the forensics on the kernel, like
Oh yes, WinPMM is, I think, can do that. It has like as a direct kernel module, I think, that reads straight from the kernel. It gets all the physical memory address, all the contents of the physical memory. It's also open source. It's what I normally use. I think it'll get everything you're looking for. And there is, I think, a feature in one of the light versions where you can specify chunks of memory to get. So if you wanted to integrate that in advanced detection, you could. I don't know of anything that does that on my own, but it's definitely something we could do.
Okay. I think it was an R&D thing, but I was just curious. It's super cool if you look into it.
Yeah, that's fine.
Any other questions?